And yeah, hi everyone. More people. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Roland Imhoff. He's a professor of social and legal psychology at the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz in Germany. He's also held previous positions at the University of Cologne and the University of Bonn. His primary research focus is on conspiracy mentality, where he uses interdisciplinary methods to understand the psychology behind the belief in conspiracy theories. And I believe that this would be the topic of your talk today, isn't it, Roland?
It will, yeah.
So over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I'll try to share my slides like this. Hope that it works.
Yeah.
Can you see them? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks again for the invitation. What I will try to do in my talk is outline the idea of conspiracy mentality a little bit, maybe also highlight some of the shortcomings that I see in the current literature and our understanding of the idea, and then close with a couple of ideas of what future research would need to clarify. And I'm happy to take questions at any time. I'm also happy to interrupt and start lengthy discussions, but then I might not finish. So if you disagree in principle, I think we postpone that until after the talk, but if there's clarification questions, please just go ahead and ask them. Okay, so this is kind of the general audience introduction to get a first feel of what we mean by conspiracy theories. I think it's safe to say that most people have a rough understanding of what conspiracy theories are and seem to recognize them when they see them, like the one that Lady Di did not die of a natural cause, but was assassinated by Charles and Camilla for them to be able to marry. The 9/11 was an inside job manufactured by American intelligence agencies, that Apollo never landed on the moon, or most recently that COVID is a hoax and does not really exist, only for the purpose of Bill Gates injecting us with microchips to run Windows on our brains. So while we seem to recognize conspiracy theories when we see them, the literature is actually pretty fuzzy when it comes to definitions. And I attribute that in part to exactly the seemingly self-evidential nature of what a conspiracy theory is. What I put up here is a quote by US Supreme Court Justice Porter Stewart, not related to conspiracy theories, but when he was pressed to define what hardcore pornography is, he basically said, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And too frequently, that is also the position that lay people, but also researchers have taken to conspiracy theories, not providing a really binding definition, but basically using examples of what they see as a conspiracy theory, as a pars pro toto, as an idea without.
Roland, we can't hear you now. Something happened to your audio.
Audio is gone.
And you can hear us.
Yeah, Roland, can you hear us? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Your audio was gone for the last 30 seconds, so I don't know what happened.
Okay.
You're back.
Well, I mean, you haven't missed much. So
Okay.
The basic idea here is that people do not really provide definitions of what they mean by conspiracy theories, and that can lead to contradiction or even normative baggage. I will explain that a little later when talking about the relation between conspiracy mentality and conspiracy beliefs. So this is a definition that has been proposed by a task force of the German Association for Psychology. that basically says conspiracy theories are suspicions that an event of some societal relevance happened because a few powerful individuals or groups have coordinated in secret to bring it about to their own advantage and the public's disadvantage. Now that might seem easy to agree with, that that's a good definition, but importantly, it lacks two criteria that are part of other definitions. And one is the accuracy criterion. A lot of people open that definition by conspiracy theories are the wrong beliefs, that. And a lot of colleagues characterize conspiracy theories as somehow contradicting an official version, being against the mainstream or against the official version of an event. And we, for both aspects, we explicitly decided against making them part of the definition. For one, putting the accuracy criterion already into the definition then often or is epistemically and pragmatically problematic and can easily lead to circular reasoning. If, for instance, you look at the literature and see that low analytical thinking skills are correlated with endorsement of conspiracy beliefs, if I define conspiracy theories as wrong beliefs and then show that people who are not good at thinking endorse things that are not true, it's bounding triviality and or even circularity. And the second aspect, the against the mainstream, the reason is basically that this is a very historically and geographically narrow understanding of conspiracy theories, because most US presidents until the 1920s, the elite in Nazi Germany and political leaders across the world are actually cultivating conspiracy theories, and therefore they are in many places and historical eras the official version and not the counter narrative. So they are the orthodox but not the heterodox knowledge. And the idea that they are fringe heterodox knowledge is actually kind of a post-World War II Western society luxury that we can deal with, but in many other places that is just not true. Okay, so this is a conspiracy theory. So what is a conspiracy mentality then? And what I show you here is a network model based on about 10,000 participants, where the correlations of the endorsement of over 30 individual conspiracy theories are portrayed or put into a network model. And network models, for those not familiar with the positive correlations, are typically indicated by both a connection between two nodes and proximity between two nodes. And what this image here, the network, clearly conveys that basically everything is associated with everything. The endorsement of every single conspiracy belief is tightly bound together with the endorsement of any other conspiracy belief. And I haven't put a label here of which conspiracy is which, because there's really not a lot differentiation here. So basically thinking that barcodes on your pasta package can control your thinking correlates positively with the idea that your neighbors hold satanic rituals in their basement. And that is a very, very, very robust phenomenon that we find in virtually any study that assesses the belief in several conspiracy theories. Now, Ted Goertzel, who originally showed that in '94, had an explanation based on what he labeled a monological belief system. So the idea was that content-wise, conspiracy theories confirm each other. So if I believe that 9/11 was an inside job, then that seems to reflect on the general idea that the US government does things in secret, and that might actually serve as proof or evidence for the notion that Apollo was a hoax. And that might then again tell me that if that was a hoax and they were never on the moon, that might mean there are actually aliens sitting on the dark side of the moon. And maybe that will also mean other things. So the idea that these are mutually reinforcing each other by confirming each other. Now, this idea received somewhat of a blow in the studies of Mike Wood and colleagues, where they showed that actually mutually contradictory conspiracy beliefs correlate positively as well. So people who were convinced that Lady Di was killed either by M16 or one of Dodi's competitors also believed that she faked her own death and is alive and kicking on a Mediterranean island or a Caribbean island. And in study 2, people who endorsed the notion that Osama bin Laden is still alive were the same who said that he was already dead when his hideout was stormed. And we have seen the same in many countries during the COVID pandemic, where people who endorsed the idea that COVID is a hoax doesn't exist were by and large the same people who said that it's probably a bioweapon that escaped a laboratory. So these seem to be actually logically difficult to reconcile with each other, both belief, but still correlate positively. That for a long time was interpreted as difficult to reconcile with Goetzel's idea of a monological belief system, because clearly the idea that Lady Di is still alive is not really confirmatory evidence for the idea that she was killed by M16. That just doesn't hold water. But so instead, the idea was, well, then maybe it's not the beliefs that are mutually reinforcing each other, but there's somewhat of a latent disposition to endorse virtually any belief. So the idea that there's a worldview, there's a basic set of assumptions that whatever happens in the world is created by design, in secret, and for the benefit of only a few. And independent of the case, that is kind of my lens to which I observe the world and apply it. And this latent disposition is what has been labeled conspiracy mentality. Now, to be fair, Jan Willem van Prooijen has a paper in Press in Psychological Science where he revisits these Wood and colleagues' findings. And what he shows is for a large number of events, first he replicates Mike Wood's findings and shows a positive correlation between mutually incompatible conspiracy beliefs. But he also shows that if you ask people before whether they believe the official version or not, that these positive correlations are exclusively driven by the people who believe the official version. So it is disbelief in two conspiracy theories that correlates with each other. But the believers actually partially show negative correlations. So the believers actually do decide on either one or the other conspiracy narrative. So it's one of the most cited findings in the theory, in the psychology of conspiracy theories, but it's just not correctly interpreted, the Wood et al. Finding. It's not the case that conspiracy believers are some lunatics who believe incompatible things at the same time. It's just the idea that among the people who disbelieve in conspiracy theories, some disbelieve them to the greatest extent, and then some disbelieve them rather pretty much, but not to the greatest extent. And that drives that correlation because they are also more numerous. But independent of this finding by Jan Willem van Prooijen, I still think there's an argument to be made that for many positive correlation between conspiracy theories, it is not plausible that there's a logical mutual reinforcement like in the monological belief system. So that big pharma poisons us with medicine somehow speaks to the idea that JFK was not killed by lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald is not a very requires more than parsimonious enterprise and making a direct connection there. You would have to go pretty far and potentially to a pretty abstract level. And once you reach that abstract level, that is exactly what we mean by conspiracy mentality. The idea that some forces are hidden in the background. Another argument that could be made is that for most events that happen in the world, you have conspiracy theories faster than anything. So very fast. So within a few minutes after a plane crashes, you typically have conspiracy theories on the web, and that might be an indication that these do not emerge in kind of a bottom-up fashion after looking at the evidence and looking at the data and weighing pros and cons, but maybe more of a schematic top-down processing, applying a worldview of whatever happens because evil people made it happen, and just merely applying that to virtually any other event you encounter in the world. So I'm still not giving up the idea that there is something like a latent disposition to endorse virtually any conspiracy belief. And I'm in good company here because that is exactly what Karl Popper described as the conspiracy theory of society. So a very general view that the idea that that the explanation of any social phenomenon consists in the discovery of the men or groups who are interested in the occurrence of this phenomenon and who have planned and conspired to bring it about. That is pretty much exactly what we mean by conspiracy mentality, the Popper idea of a conspiracy theory of society. And in most of the studies that use the concept of conspiracy mentality, it's measured in a way that does not specifically mention conspiracy theories, not events or actors or culprits, but tries to tap into the general idea. So this is something like most people do not realize to what extent our lives are determined by conspiracies hatched in secret, or politicians and other leaders are nothing but string puppets of the force acting in the background. So this is not basically naming an actor. It's not saying what they do, but it's basically trying to tap into the idea that such things happen. And if we give this 5-item scale to a representative sample of Germans and look at the distribution of the agreement, we get any diagnostician would be very happy. We get an almost perfect normal distribution around the midpoint of the scale. So it is not the case that conspiracy mentality or conspiracy thinking can be best understood as 10 to 15% of complete lunatics believing just illogical things and the rest of the world being safe and sane. But it's more a question of shades of gray, of degrees, to which extent you indeed suspect that things in the world happen because some people planned to bring them about. And normatively, it's not the case that the lowest potential score here would be the most rational one, because surely humans have it in their behavioral arsenal to conspire or to make plans in secret to their advantage. So suspecting that that happens from time to time is not outrageously dumb. It's you could argue that people who have the absolute lowest score on this conspiracy mentality dimension actually could also be portrayed as naive or gullible or a little bit too trusting. And that is important because that is what I mentioned when I said that a lot of the literature is normatively laden. And I think we have to be very careful also in terms of the context that people live in. What Sinan Alpa, for instance, has shown is that people tend to endorse conspiracy theories to a greater extent if they live in an environment where there's the objective indicators for the level of corruption point to a rather high level, right? Why? Because then it is most likely there's probably a signal there, and more people detect that signal to infer that's what happened here. That doesn't mean that conspiracy theories are all right. That doesn't mean that it's always the most plausible, but it's also not the case that any endorsement of any conspiracy belief is prima facie wrong. And if we look at the connection, we have done that in a recent current opinion paper between conspiracy mentality and the endorsement of specific conspiracy belief. This is typically what we find, that conspiracy mentality, as you can see on the top, is typically normally distributed, is virtually always obviously positively correlated with the endorsement of specific conspiracy theories. I mean, that's kind of how people think about what conspiracy mentality is. But specific conspiracy theories usually have a very skewed distribution. So very few people endorse specific conspiracy theories, as you can see on the right-hand side. Now, this has all kinds of trickle-down problems. One of the problems with using specific conspiracy beliefs as a variable in trying to understand why people endorse conspiracies is that in that skewed distribution, obviously, very few people have very strong leverage on the overall correlations, because you only have a handful of people who endorse these specific conspiracy theories, but they can easily drive a positive correlation. And you could argue whether that's a very adequate description. We don't have that problem with conspiracy mentality because it's usually pretty normally distributed, and therefore there's less extreme leverage of few people. So if I think of that connection in a very oversimplified way, I would say the endorsement of a specific conspiracy belief is the result of the general tendency to endorse conspiracy, so the conspiracy mentality, but also the ideological match. And just to give you an example, these are right-wing conspiracy theories, so conspiracies, whatever, are blaming governments on increasing immigration. And as you can see, that correlates positively with political orientation, as it should. Whereas for conspiracy mentality, the general tendency to see conspiracies at play, that is less straightforwardly so. What we typically find, and this is a study across 26 countries, is a somewhat not symmetrical, but somewhat U-shaped relation between the endorsement of conspiracy mentality and political orientation. Now, if I try to research conspiracy beliefs by handpicking some arbitrary conspiracy theories and do not control for what we label content contamination or ideological contamination, I might come up with spurious correlations and say, well, Republicans are more prone to conspiracy beliefs than Democrats, or left-wingers believe more in conspiracy theories than right-wingers. But arguably, maybe they don't, but it's just that the ideological match part that is part of the endorsement of a specific conspiracy belief points in one or the other direction. So that's important to consider when relating conspiracy beliefs to, for instance, political orientation, but also other variables. And the same is true if we look at the literature. We by now have a very strong and robust evidence that the endorsement of conspiracy beliefs is negatively related to cognitive reflection skills or analytical thinking. And that seems like a great finding. People who are not very good at thinking smart endorse conspiracy theories to a greater extent. But as I already said, the problem in that is if I pick as good examples of conspiracy theories that are wrong, that are sometimes even stupid or not logical, then what else am I expected to find? But that has nothing to do with the psychological disposition to endorse conspiracy beliefs. It's just a spurious correlation driven by the fact that people use conspiracy theories that are wrong as their typical example of conspiracy theories. Well, maybe that is the case, that most conspiracy theories in the wild are actually wrong, but maybe not. Maybe that's a problem with everyday language, that once a conspiracy theory has evidence in its basket, we stop calling it a conspiracy theory and say it's investigative journalism or something along those lines. So that is actually also somewhat of a problem. Now, conspiracy mentality is relatively pretty much temporally stable, which is nice if measures are reliable. It's not so nice if we have hopes to have small scale psychological interventions change people's degree on this, right? I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of spontaneous fluctuation, at least. Okay, so, and if we want to, that's what I try to do in the next couple of minutes, relate the measure, the self-reported measure of conspiracy mentality to other measures to kind of explore its what we call cognitive architecture, to describe what is the psychological makeup of people who score high and or low on conspiracy mentality. And one is they seem to be particularly sensitive to patterns and intentions. We have this finding in Jan Willem van Pooyen's paper, whereby it shows people a sequence of coin courses and asks them, was that random or was it somehow determined? The tendency to answer that was determined is positively correlated to the general tendency to endorse conspiracy beliefs. We have something similar where we give people scatter plots and ask them to guess how big is that correlation that is portrayed here in the scatter plots. People are not very good at it, but in all that noise, you can find a positive correlation with conspiracy mentality. And the same is true for intentionality or agency detection. So there's these typical scales that tap into anthropomorphism that is a facet of hyperactive agency detection that has items like, to what extent does a television set experience emotions, or to what extent does the wind decide where it will blow? And here also you find positive correlation with conspiracy mentality. And Karen Douglas has used these Haida triangle animations where a big triangle chases a small triangle, and ask participants to what extent the movement of the triangle is the result of a conscious decision on part of the small triangle, and that also correlates positively with the endorsement of conspiracy beliefs in general. Now, part of the literature has argued, why would people have a conspiracy mindset or a conspiracy mentality? And very many colleagues come back to evolutionary theorizing, arguing that it might have been helpful once upon a time for our ancestors to actually have such a conspiracy mindset. And that is very much informed by error management theory. Most of you will be familiar, but I'm going to walk through real quickly. Error management theory actually posits that people can make two different kind of mistakes, and one is costlier than the other. So if others did conspire against me because they agreed to kill me while sleeping to share the mammoth among themselves, and I detect that, that's good. If there was no such plan and I don't suspect it, that's also good. If the others had no plan actually to kill me and eat the mammoth without me, but I suspect so, that might get me excluded or disliked by the others because I'm so over-suspecting. If the others have a plan to kill me while I'm lying there, but I don't see it coming, that's a lot more costly than getting a reputation of being not very agreeable. So that's the gist of error management theory, that one error is more costly than the other. So it was evolutionary adaptive to err on one side rather than the other, and to be rather suspicious than to be rather too suspicious than too unsuspicious. And we try to connect this error management theorizing to the finding that conspiracy beliefs or conspiracy mentality is typically negatively related to interpersonal trust, as people reported. And that is typically, or that is often interpreted as indicative of a problem with people who believe in conspiracies to a great extent. And that would be resonated in the idea that they have too many false alarms, so that they have actually are also distrustful of people who could be trusted. But that's not the only reason why such a correlation can come about. It can also be, as seen here, that the left guy has no mean intentions, and no one suspects him to have any mean intentions. But the right guy is actually pretty dangerous, and conspiracy believers, here indicated by the right, actually do detect that, but non-believers oversee it, right? Because they are too trustful. That would actually lead to the correlation that is described in the literature. So that would be actually adaptive or functional. Obviously, the same correlation could also be the result of everybody knowing when there's danger. But as I mentioned, conspiracy believers just ringing the false alarm much more frequently, right? Being suspicious even in situations where there's no reason to be so. They could be dysfunctional. And arguably, you could also argue that it's just the main effect, that conspiracy believers are both more sensitive to real threat, but also oversensitive in the absence of threat. And we try to actually get at it in two research lines, where in this line, we gave participants images and asked them, is this person trustworthy or not? And in these 92 images, we morphed them slightly into the direction of low versus high trustworthiness. And it's really subtle. As you can see, I mean, down here, the left version is a little bit morphed into the direction of low trustworthiness. The right version of the same person is morphed into the direction of more. And that was all participants had to do. Press a button and tell us, is this person trustworthy or not? Our findings do not support either the false alarm or the accurate cue detection theory, but the third option. So what we can see here is that the two lines, the turquoise dotted line is above the red line. So that means overall participants were above chance accurate in detecting the untrustworthy face. And what we can also see that both lines actually have a negative slope. So that means the higher the conspiracy mentality, the greater the tendency to detect untrustworthiness. But there is no interaction whatsoever, right? I mean, conspiracy believers were not more ready to detect distrust in untrustworthy faces, nor were they more ready to make a false alarm for trustworthy face. But these are just two additive main effects. And this is just trustworthiness detection in faces. So we did something really similar, but this time with the well-known behavioral trust game. Most of you might be familiar with that, originally proposed by Berg. It goes like that, there's player A and player B. Both start with an endowment of, for example, 10 euros. And then player A can send as much as they like to player B. The amount is tripled. And then player B can send back as much as they like. Now, in the best of all worlds, player A sends 10 points, that is tripled. So player B receives 30 points, now has 40 points. And because player B is a nice guy, he sends back, or she sends back 20 points. Both have 20, both have basically doubled their original endowment and go home with more. Now that's the ideal situation. But for that to happen, player A actually has to trust player B that player B will send back an adequate amount. And to the extent that player A doesn't really trust player B, they might send less than the whole endowment. And instead send, as in this example, only half the endowment. And then player B can send back from there, in this case, 25 points. And then both can still win. But in this experimental setup, the maximum outcome can only be achieved if both players, player A trusts and player B behaves trustworthy. So what we did then is we had players shown by photographs where we morphed social threat cues into the player's face, and that was, we used facial anger as a social threat cue, with the idea that conspiracy mentality high scorers might be particularly sensitive to such social threat cues in the environment. The long story short, the same pattern as previously. People detect the social threat cue, they send less money to the somewhat angry looking players, but everybody does so. And conspiracy believers trust less, so they send overall less money, but by and large independent of the social threat cue. And in study 3, we actually, because study 1, you could argue the social threat cue wasn't really meaningful, but study 3, the social threat cue actually led to worse outcomes because people who had anger morphed into their face actually did send back less money. But still, we have only these two additive main effects, but no indication of whether conspiracy mentality is particularly functional in detecting bad behavior, nor dysfunctional in ringing false alarms. Which brings me kind of to my third aspect of the what we label cognitive architecture, and that is the suspicion of negative intentions and or secret coordination. And we use drift diffusion modeling to tap into that, because if you look at these decisions people make, that they suspect threat or suspect negative intention or suspect secret coordination, there's several ways how this could come about. And we had the hope that drift diffusion modeling would help us get an understanding of what is the most plausible process by which this comes about. And for those of you, are you familiar with drift diffusion modeling? Who needs a brief? Yes? Okay, so the idea was that the simplest one prediction would follow from a presupposition hypothesis that I don't even need to see the evidence. I'm just gonna say there's evil intent and secret coordination, and that would if I have a bias in giving such a response before I can even see the concrete example, that would in diffusion modeling affect the starting bias, right? Because I just have a greater tendency to say yes, there are negative intentions involved before I even know what people are talking about, before I even know the have the description of the event I'm supposed to react on. There's a second hypothesis that follows pretty easily from the literature, where conspiracy beliefs have been connected to jumping to conclusion bias or more shallow kind of system 1 information processing, and that would suggest they take overall less information into account, right? So the boundary separation in drift diffusion models, the amount of information that is sampled before you come to a decision should be lower. And the third option refers to the drift rate, so a process that does describe the speed of accumulating information, and that could be seen as somewhat of a confirmatory information processing. So you need to apply your schematic idea about the world to a concrete case, and that might bias you in a direction. And if it confirms your prior reasoning, that's faster than if you have to update and correct your prior reasoning, and that would affect the drift rate. That was our argument. So we ran 4-ish experiments, and this is a meta-analysis across all 4. I'm saying 4-ish because some had between subject conditions that we treated separately as separate data points in this meta-analysis. So this is actually 6 data points. And this, what you see here is the meta-analytic correlation with conspiracy mentality. So what we see there is on the behavioral outcome, on the responses, we have a rather robust correlation. In each and every study, conspiracy mentality correlates positively with the tendency to suspect negative intentions and or secret coordination. And the strongest association we find is with the starting bias. So basically with the tendency to say so before any concrete information is seen. And we also have an independent association with the drift rate. but we do not have any association with the boundary separation. So we don't find any evidence for jumping to conclusion or more shallow information processing. We can discuss that later. One problem might be that with the number of trials we have in the lower hundreds, drift diffusion models are typically not very potent to tell apart drift rate and starting bias, because the effect they have on the distribution of responses and response times are not particularly easily distinguishable. But these findings are robust, independent of whether we use a hierarchical Bayesian drift diffusion modeling or modeling with FastDM and Kolmogorov-Smirnov and or maximum likelihood estimates. So it's it could still be that starting bias and drift rate are actually only one of them plays a role, but at least all approaches we tested come to the same conclusion, that they both have incremental and independent contribution to this correlation. Okay, so as I said, conspiracy theories are not wrong necessarily, and the conspiracy mentality describes a propensity to see conspiracies that is also not wrong per se. But then that doesn't also mean that it's particularly functional. I think the recent pandemic has highlighted that it might not be super functional. Endorsement of COVID-related conspiracy theories showed across a couple of dozens, by now more than 100 countries, negative correlation with effective preventive measures, at least self-reported. And that's also true for a number of studies that tapped into that with random intercept cross-like panel analyses in a longitudinal fashion. So conspiracy theories at T1 negatively predicted compliance with preventive measures above and beyond its autoregression. And so they seem to have been dysfunctional for the collective efforts of curbing the infection rate, but also for the individual, with a kind of two handful of findings that people rely on so-called alternative remedies. So they drink purified water or snake oil or chlorodyne or ivermectin in the hope that that will actually keep them healthy, which it won't. As we know, people were less willing to get vaccinated. That's almost trivial, this association. But also, if you take conspiracy theories at T1, you can show that this correlates positively with the likelihood to test positive for COVID 1 year later. So it's not super functional for the self either, at least if you don't think that you want to catch COVID to boost your immune system. So it seems to be problematic. Then why do people believe these conspiracy theories? What's that to be gained? As I said, one argument could be the error management idea, but then again, we find no evidence that this is super functional and actually being more accurate. But then maybe it is not about accuracy, but about social capital, so to speak. So one thing we have looked at is the idea that it endows people with a feeling to have superior and unique insight into the world, and it makes people special. So this is even for psychologists, this is a difficult graph to read. That's why I'm going to walk you through, where we looked at the endorsement of roughly 100 conspiracy theories and correlated it with the need for uniqueness. It's also difficult to read because the axes are mislabeled. It should be the other way around. So a point, a dot above the dotted line means there's a positive correlation between the need for uniqueness and the endorsement of a conspiracy belief. But that is much higher, or that is systematically higher for conspiracy theories that only a few people endorse. right? Because if everybody believes it, 50% of Americans think JFK was not killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't gain anything from believing that as well. I cannot feel unique by making that claim. If and that's actually one of the theories here, if I think that the Nazis live on the dark side of the moon, that will make me feel special, because that's something that only very few people agree with. So that will kind of endow me with very exclusive knowledge about how the world operates. And we try to test that also experimentally by telling Americans that allegedly there was a debate in the German public around mandatory smoke detectors, and that a retired engineer had detected that these smoke detectors that are mandatory in German apartments actually emanate ultrasound, and that this ultrasound causes nausea and depression and gastritis. And coincidentally, the largest lobby for these mandatory smoke detectors was allegedly also the largest producer of them, but they denied the allegations, and so did the government. And within this, there was a public opinion survey whereby 81% of the German population doubted the official statements that there was nothing fishy about these smoke detectors. So 81% of the population believed the smoke detector conspiracy theory. That was condition 1. Condition 2 was the opposite. 81% of Germans actually trusted the government, that that's probably not true. So only a minority believed the smoke detector conspiracy theory. So what we find here is people with low conspiracy mentality overall do not endorse the smoke detector conspiracy to a great extent. And if they do, this is actually, the two bars are significantly different from each other. If they do, more so if the majority does it. So that's Diane Mackey, 87. The majority is correct because it implies correctness. Or Ash, if you will, or no, Ash is normative. So informational influence. If I do not know anything about the world, I should probably rely on what the majority of people think. So that's what people low in conspiracy mentality do. People high in conspiracy mentality overall do endorse the smoke detector conspiracy theory to a much greater extent, but even more so if only a minority believes in it. So if the majority of Germans think it's true, it kind of loses its appeal because it doesn't make you feel unique and special anymore. There's not a lot to be gained. You don't have this exclusive advantage over the sheeple who are naive idiots. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. So I think by now, over the last, say, 10 years of research activity, the field has actually accumulated a lot of data. It's an extremely fast-growing field. And that's partially due to the fact because conspiracy beliefs or conspiracy mentality reliably correlates with stuff. And does so quite robustly. So conspiracy mentality correlates with hyperactive agency detection, prejudice against high power groups, lower epistemic trust in high power sources, trust in general, extreme political orientations, obviously the credibility of conspiracy beliefs, that's almost tautological, the need for uniqueness, feelings of powerlessness, less formal education, anti-vax attitudes, loneliness. It's temporarily relatively stable, and so far immune to any efforts to manipulate it experimentally. So that is, I think, kind of the state of the knowledge we have now, but that's not a lot, because there's a lot that we do not know, actually. Because if conspiracy mentality is indeed temporarily stable and not susceptible to manipulations, it still has to come from somewhere, right? I mean, we're currently collecting data in high schools, trying to look at process of political socialization to get an idea. At some point, people have to actually cultivate this worldview. And you could even make the argument that for most people, there has to be a tipping point of actually identifying with authorities, right? In kindergarten, most kids want to become cops or firefighters, and their parents are actually role models. And 20 years later, if they score high on conspiracy mentality, they seem to have the opposite idea of what authorities stand for, maybe for deceiving people. So that's the question: what determines my baseline level that is somewhat robust over time? But as much as we have evidence of relatively strong stability, the correlation across time is not one, so there is fluctuation there. But that's also not really known under which conditions people actually change on that dimension. And I'm gonna put myself out there and say we probably will not find out by testing 2-minute subtle psychological experimental manipulations, but we might fare better with actually longitudinal studies looking at biographical crises, for instance, because I speak a lot on the phone to mostly relatives or friends of people who have made a turn into the direction of becoming more conspiracy believing, and that seems to be, so far no rock hard evidence, but that seems to be, at least in hindsight, often connected to biographical crises, to loss of job, loss of reputation, loss of partnership or family structure. But that could obviously also be just a post hoc rationalization, and the evidence is still not really missing. Now, I repeatedly claimed that conspiracy beliefs are not inaccurate per se, but at the same time, I mean, my point is not to belittle the social cost that actually come along with particularly extreme conspiracy beliefs. So if I talk to either security agency or politicians, or sometimes also journalists, that's kind of their number one question. Where on this dimension can we make a cutoff? At what point does it become dangerous? If we survey people from the conspiracy theory scene, what are the indicators that would suggest we need to devote more attention to them? Or if we have job hiring procedures at the police, shouldn't we make people fill in a questionnaire and see whether they are fit for the job and what would be still okay and where does it become dangerous? No, I don't think that is an answerable question and I don't think the evidence allows for any kind of individual diagnostic. But I think it's still an interesting theoretical question to think about, where such tipping points of discontinuous development in either one or the other direction come, because you can oscillate around in the middle, but some people at some point enter a loop of becoming more and more radicalized in their reasoning about the world. And a lot of the kind of the appeal of doing conspiracy research, what many people do these days, is I think, not very well substantiated assumption so far that it is conspiracy mentality and or beliefs that causes behavior. Because more than 90% of the published evidence we have actually relies on cross-sectional correlations at best. So there's a few longitudinal studies, mostly relating to COVID-related behavioral measures, but these are the few, and B, even in these cases, behavior is typically self-reported. So this so far it doesn't really stand on very stable footing so far, I would say. And this is just an exemplification that I brought. If we do, because within the German discourse, there was recently a big study on adolescence and loneliness, and huge press coverage with an event with our secretary for family affairs. They, under the headline, being lonely makes you believe in conspiracy theories. Now, what that was based on was a cross-sectional correlation in an admittedly large study. So if you do actually the work and conduct longitudinal models and subject them to random intercept cross-leg panel models, you do find it's true. Conspiracy mentality is positively associated with loneliness, but there is no longitudinal connection. There's no prediction. So the intra-individual effects do not imply any causality of any kind. We have a positive autoregressive causality on the loneliness measure, which is kind of sad because it implies feeling lonely at T1 makes you feel more lonely at T2, makes you feel even more lonely at T3. But that is all they have. We have no evidence of any causal path to or from conspiracy beliefs. And with that kind of disclaimer, I'll end here and thank you for the attention and my collaborators for being my collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. That was fascinating. I'm afraid we don't have a lot of time for questions and discussions now. I don't know, Steve, do you have time afterwards, or do you need to go somewhere?
No, I have to go somewhere. I'm giving the talk now here in Dortmund,
okay.
So I got to run out. But thanks very much, Roland. That was fantastic. Maybe Alessandro wants to comment on the incoherent stuff that you mentioned at the at the beginning, because there's an update to that story.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm curious to hear.
So basically, we found a very strong evidence for endorsement of incoherent statements. So basically, Karen Douglas was right, but both Karen and Van Proyen had analyzed the data in a wrong way, we will say. So basically, they were using correlation to claim that there was this coherent endorsement, but yeah, so basically correlation don't do much.
So what does the trick then?
Yeah, so basically you can simply multiply the items on the Likert, you know, from 0 to 5, for example, and if you multiply them, then you have a measure of incoherence. So in that way, yeah, you get the trick.
So basically, Alessandro, we analyzed the data you mentioned by Van Proyen, and it has very strong evidence for incoherence in there among people who reject the official account. And I think what on average it's about 10% of all the people endorse incoherent conspiracy theory, something like that. Among those who reject the official account, among those who endorse it, it's near 0%. So there's a massive difference. And the measure Alessandro was talking about is an interactive distance measure, so that it's you know, it picks up incoherence selectively, unlike the correlation. And that's, you know, the evidence to our mind is quite strong that there is incoherence.
Yeah, I mean, I would still, even before Jan Willem did that, I mean, you could still make the principal argument that on a 7-point scale, given twice a 6 is not incoherent, because you don't bet your life on both accounts being true. You just find them both plausible, and there's nothing illogical about that.
That's true.
I mean, yes, but okay, well, that's a detailed wrinkle. We can talk about that later. But anyway, we're working on a response to that paper and hope to have it out soon.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll be happy to have a look at it. Curious.
Okay, so I think Steve probably needs to go, and I don't know what's your time schedule, like Roland, but if you have another 5 minutes, maybe we can have.
I have another 5 minutes. I'm really sorry that I went over time I get carried away.
No, it was
I didn't
fascinating.
have.
So I didn't want to stop you. So if anyone has questions or comments, now is the time. Yeah, Angelo.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, Roland. Very interesting. I'm a big fan of your work. And yeah, I was interested in the first part of your talk about the definition of conspiracy theories. And I read from my own work on the definition or the demarcation criterion of pseudoscience. I have some papers about that, and that was a substantial part of my PhD dissertation. And what I found is that at some point of history, I think the concept of pseudoscience became weaponized and used as a in political rhetorics to discredit the opponent, right? Like, no, this is pseudoscience. So what I think one of the reasons why the demarcation criterion of pseudoscience has been so frustrating for philosophers is because they were trying to subsume into the same concept something like homeopathy and something like sociobiology or neoclassical economy, because those things were labeled as pseudoscience at some point of history, right? So I think it would be interesting to try a similar strategy in the context of conspiracy theories, because I also note that the scope of the concept is increasingly expansive, that many people use the word that's a conspiracy theory just to, in a parliament, to discredit the other party. Sometimes we're trying to subsume something like QAnon and something like, maybe pharmaceutical companies are pulling some strings in our politics, right? Yeah, that's so maybe if we move to the most extreme cases, like, yeah, as I said, QAnon, the Kennedy assassination, these very clear instances of conspiracy theories, maybe that will facilitate the solution of the demarcation of conspiracy theories, because there are some like clear parallelisms in these cases, like complete lack of plausible or evidence with a minimum quality standard, things like that. The apparition of many, an explosion of versions just because some guy on a Reddit thread is inventing another version of the same conspiracy theory. So yeah, that may facilitate, I think, the.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a kind of the opposite strategy of what I would argue for, because what you suggest is align our definition of what a conspiracy theory is with lay people's usage of the term, because they use it as a defamatory term to imply non-factuality, and that might actually be easier to change our definition than to change how lay people use the term. But I would still argue for the fact to kind of fight for the idea that just because something is a conspiracy theory doesn't mean it's not correct. I mean, arguing that the elite of Nazi Germany met at a house at the Wannsee to plan and logistically prepare the mass murder of European Jewry is a conspiracy theory. There's a lot of evidence for that, but it is a conspiracy theory because it's a theory about people conspiring.
Yeah, but in that case, you're removing the empirical accuracy to the definition of a conspiracy theory, and that becomes that now you want to define any conspirational explanation, right? Yeah, that makes the concept too broad, I think. Or when you have a concept that defines everything and nothing at the same time, is very difficult to define, right? So maybe if we differentiate between conspiracy explanations and conspiracy theories, consider that conspiracy theories are something similar to pseudoscience or paranormal thought, that's the approach I defended in a couple of articles about pseudoscience.
Yeah, but I mean, I
As
can
a-
see,
Yeah,
I can see and understand that I think the danger here is that we very easily and quickly do not agree on terms. So instead of agreeing what the term means and debating its relation to the world or whatever, we argue whether something is a conspiracy theory or not, because in order to know, if you use that definition, we have to establish ground truth. Now, even the physicists cannot establish ground truth. Why, or how on hell can we expect to ever reach a consensual ground truth on social happenings in the world? Because only if we all agreed and we're really sure whether that's accurate or not and what happened, can we actually employ the label conspiracy theory to those notions about reality that do not apply and are plainly wrong. But as soon as someone disagrees with you, they will just say, well, then that's not a conspiracy theory. For a field of research trying to understand why people endorse conspiracy theory, that's a problem, because then a claim oscillates between being a conspiracy theory or not, depending on the state of the evidence, but also the perspective of the perceiver.
I have a question relating to the hyperagency finding, and it speaks to, like, if we put it in terms of sense of control, it puts it like into or locus of control, right? So we see a lot of controlling powerful others, or an external locus of control, I would say. But I was interested in trying to. Is there some evidence about their internal locus of control as well? Is there some evidence about how they feel, like how people who have high conspiracy mentality, and about their own sense of agency?
I don't know of any if we use the narrow term, right? I mean, there's these experimental psychological approaches where you tap into the association people have between their own behavior and outcomes. Like they click a light switch, and then with the delay, the light goes on, and they're asked to what extent was it caused by you clicking the switch or by us. There's no evidence in that sense. In the terms of, if you take the broader understanding of agency, you do have some indications of low agency. So people describe themselves as more powerless, as they typically score high on anomia questionnaires, so saying that the world has become too complicated for them to understand what actually goes about. So if you use these softer measures of agency, they perceive them as low in agency.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time and for the wonderful talk. And I think I'll stop the recording here now.
Okay, thanks for having me again.